So good afternoon, everyone. So just to introduce myself first, I'm Jennifer Brennan. I am the Deputy Chair of the National Research Integrity Forum, and I also work for an organisation called THEA, which represents Institutes, Technology and Technological Universities. I'm here in place of Professor Anita Maguire, who unfortunately is unwell with that respiratory illness that shall not be named. This is what happens these days, I guess, and people have to pull out at short notice, unfortunately. So I'm really delighted to be here. I think I probably speak for everybody in the room when I say this has been a really fascinating, interesting day. I've really enjoyed all of the presentations. I think it's been great. It's been really thought-provoking. So thank you to our hosts from UCD. It's been a really great event. I'm joined on the panel today. We have about an hour for this. We'll see how things are going. I know we're running a little bit late, and if people have to sort of peel away at 5 o'clock, that's obviously completely understandable. So I'm joined on the panel today by 5 very interesting people. So first of all, Daniel Bradley, who's the Professor of Population Genetics in Trinity College Dublin. Beside him, I have Robin Flynn, who's the Graduate Studies Project Manager from SETU. In the middle there is Nikki O'Connor, who's a Policy Advisor in Research and Innovation Policy in Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. They could have come with a shorter name. And then we have Professor Orla Feely, Vice President for Research, Innovation and Impact at University College Dublin. And last but not least, Niamh Wycherley, is it? Wycherley, sorry, apologies. Should have asked that beforehand. Wycherley, Assistant Professor of Medieval Irish History at Maynooth University. So I think, can I take a microphone with me, or what should I do? Don't know. Oh yeah, maybe you might give me the roving mic. Because I'm going to sit down for this one, because I don't feel like standing for an hour. It feels like I'm a school teacher shouting questions at the people on the panel. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start, first of all, I think, with Orla, if that's okay. Orla, considering some of the things that we've heard today, you know, as somebody who's trying to drive an institutional research strategy, do you feel there's a tension between pushing forward that research strategy? And we heard a mention of, you know, university rankings, et cetera, earlier on, between that and trying to develop a healthy research culture.
That's a really interesting question and goes to the core of a lot of the things that we've been kind of dancing around a bit today, because as was commented from the floor, university rankings, you know, are completely orthogonal to what we've been talking about here today. So we have to be aware of that, and yet I think that we have to be aware, if you looked at the logo that we had for our UCD activity in this area, we have culture, we have integrity, and at the top we have excellence. So if done right, a positive research culture is not at all orthogonal to excellence. It is completely supportive of it. So I think that we have to really make sure that that happens. Now, we still, we work in a pressurized environment. We work in a competitive environment, and there's no getting around that. You know, when you're making your first presentation at a conference, applying for a tenure track position, doing an interview for an ERC panel, these are highly pressurized environments, and there's no getting around that. When you're applying for a research grant, when you're trying to get a publication out before your competitors, again, that requires a lot of work, a lot of intensive work at a period of time. So there are periods we have to give feedback as part of the research training process. That feedback can sometimes be hard for the recipient to receive. So those are still realities of our environment. And yet, if we do things right, if people know going before a panel, it will be conducted with dignity and respect. It will take into account all the facets of their contribution. If they know that when feedback is being given, again, it will be given in an atmosphere of dignity and respect and constructive attitude. These are the things that can take what is by definition still going to be a pressurized and competitive environment, but make it more human and more humane in many ways. And for institutions who choose not to engage with this because it doesn't accord with their values or their view of their competitive positioning, there's no getting away from this environment. All the drivers are towards this. You look at what funders are expecting, what government is expecting, what our research population is expecting. You look at, say, social media and the voice that researchers have there. I was struck by an article in Nature there a week or two ago about a worldwide shortage of postdocs because people are no longer willing to put up with some of the expectations around that type of career path. So, all the winds are blowing in a certain direction where we have to be holistic in our treatment of our people, and it is only through that that we could truly deliver excellence. So there will be tensions, as you say, but we just have to find a way through them.
Nikki, then, so Orla brought up government then, so I suppose you've been really instrumental in putting together our new research and innovation strategy, Impact 2030, and it has a strategic objective in there around research culture. So, I mean, as you start to think about implementing that strategy, how do you see it supporting a healthy research culture, kind of working in partnership with the other people in the system?
Okay, thank you. First, thank you very much to Grace for the invitation. Is that all right? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's super to be here today, and having been buried for several months in national strategy development, it's always a relief to come up for air and really hear about what's going on the ground, because that's where we learn. And I think with Impact 2030, if I were to try to sum up Impact 2030 in one line, its really core aim is to ensure that our research activity and our research investments make as big a difference as possible to as many people as possible. That's it in a nutshell. And I think, Maura, we've all been very struck by your photographic evolution of how these things move on. This is the 4th national strategy that I've been involved in. And I think, it's very interesting to see some of the shifts from Innovation 2020, our last strategy, to Impact 2030. Some of the main changes or differences being, for example, we've had a global pandemic. Which have had a lot of positive outcomes for the research community, but also a lot of challenges. Positives obviously being, it's the vaccine, I think, number one, but also, the public recognition of the value of research and innovation. I think on the more challenging side, I think certainly anecdotally, but I think it is commonly accepted that there was a gendered effect of lab closures, etc. So there's a lot to play through from that. We also have the establishment of 5 technological universities. Massive structural development, positive structural development in the Irish landscape. Also, from a structural perspective, we've had the establishment, obviously, of DFERIS. I'm not even going to try to do it again. And with that, one of the fundamental points, important points, is that it has brought together and is bringing even closer together 2 significant competitive funding agencies, as in Science Foundation Ireland and the Irish Research Council. It also, for the first time, importantly, is bringing together the core funding of the institutions with the competitive funding. And, I'm not too sure, because I will admit I was even surprised by it, that if you look at our national surveys on higher education research activity, at least 1/3 of the expenditure comes from the block grant. Which isn't something we always, I certainly hadn't realised. So there's been that development. I think that from a wider European perspective, we are seeing a shift, and will continue absolutely to drive the economic impact of research and innovation, but there is a wider recognition of the societal value of R&I. And also then to say that I think with research culture, it's really reassuring to hear if somebody noted that we brought out research culture in its totality very explicitly. That was a very conscious decision and very much reflected the extensive contributions the stakeholder made to that process. Within research culture itself and what we can do, the focus of Impact 2030, and to be very clear, it's at system level. We do not in any way supplant the expertise and the activities of other agencies who are far stronger in those spaces, but this is what can we do at a system level that will help everybody. And I think within research culture, I would probably specifically call out the principles of good practice in research in higher education institutions that were developed by the HEA in 2019 under Orla's expert guidance. I just wrote. What these try to do is articulate, because there's so much going on, I think that's become so clear, articulate in some cohesive sense what are the main principles of good practice, which really in another way of saying culture. And we have 7 of those at present, if I try to remember them right. Excellent research and academic freedom, research integrity and ethics, open research, knowledge transfer, project management, researcher development, and dignity and respect. And the institutions commit annually to the HEA that they are living and endorsing those principles. Now, it's interesting, and Grace, Orla beat me to it, but in terms of what are the next buzzwords, the HEA is in the process of updating those principles, and to the best of my understanding, 2 of the main shifts in that are a far greater drawing out of the EDI agenda, the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion agenda, which I think has come up all of our radars, and then secondly, the sustainability piece. So more, I'm not too sure with your agenda planning for, but you know, it wouldn't surprise me to see in sustainability. So I think that's from, you know, in terms of a government perspective, what we're trying to do is bring some level of, without homogenising things, but bring some level of consistency to help everybody move forward in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've heard some really good and interesting contributions today from, I suppose, people who are trying to steer the system. So we've heard from research funders, we've heard from people in libraries, but what we haven't really heard today is the researcher perspective. And so I'm delighted that Dan and Niamh are here. So I'm going to ask Dan first. I suppose, as somebody who's established in their research career, this whole area of research culture, you know, it's fairly new. Maura showed it in her presentation. It's only kind of become in the last 2 years, maybe since the Wellcome Trust. We were talking about research integrity before, and now we're talking about research culture. What's your perspective on this newish area? I mean, I'd particularly be interested in your perspective on research metrics and this research assessment and how they're used.
Okay, thank you very much. Research, well, I guess we've always been aware of research culture and the contrast between different fields, different labs, different individuals. One of the problems with research culture, not just here, is that it's too driven by the principal investigator in scientific labs. There's too much of everything vested in one person. So that's a structural flaw, not just here, it's in science in general, maybe in other disciplines as well. On metrics, yeah, I'm interested to hear, you know, if we could get a barring order for a thing, the H index would be not allowed within 100 meters of this building, right? I don't really share that. I mean, citations are important. I am old enough to remember when funding in Ireland was divided up using political metrics. In smoke-filled rooms, the pie was divided out, and I was certainly too junior to know how it was divided out. And metrics were useful. They blew that open, you know? Instead of somebody saying, I am the best person in this field, well, you could say, well, actually, let's look at the figures. Figures are useful. I'm a quantitative scientist. Now, there are problems if you rely too much on one metric. If you look at someone's record, you have to look at it upside down, sideways, back to front. You have to try and get a holistic view of it. But to say that citations are not important is rubbish. If someone has a paper that's cited 500 times, that's a major achievement. It's really difficult to get published in Nature, and I certainly won't be advising my junior colleagues not to try and publish in Nature because it's at the minute part of the career path. It may change. And if I see it on a CV, they may have been lucky, but more likely they did some really hard work and they worked extremely smart and got something published in Nature. So I don't see it as a negative. The problem can be if you weigh too much one metric or one thing like impact factor. But let's not throw out metrics and with it one component of meritocracy.
So we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Niamh, turning to you then, and you're a researcher who comes from the humanities, obviously, so quite a contrast to what Dan is used to as a STEM researcher and myself as an ex-STEM researcher. Do you think there's any specific aspects of research culture in the humanities area that we need to take into account?
Well, yeah, there's so many different things. Just kind of what I've been thinking about today and listening to everything, because it has all been very STEM focused. One of the things that just kept on coming to mind was how in the humanities it is so personality driven kind of, and who you know still makes a big difference. That whole idea as well, we were just hearing about earlier about sharing information, you know, sharing knowledge and everything. It's still in the humanities, I'm in the discipline of history, if you know someone who has an edition of a text or something that's unpublished or an unpublished paper and then people in the know share it amongst themselves and they don't publish it because they don't want to get attacked for their conclusions. So you have so many footnotes in history papers and history books that say, you know, personal communication or, you know, share different, or thank you, you know, for sharing that, which is, you know, completely useless to a student because they don't have access to the data that's underpinning the argument. So I do think I'm a PI now of an SFI IRC pathway project, And what I actually enjoyed about the process, which everyone found quite painful, but was that the application, it wasn't just a humanities application. It was, you had to all, us in the humanities had to satisfy all the kind of STEM criteria, which was a very interesting challenge because you had to think about the impact that your research was really making. So not just that you published a book, but what was the point of the book in the first place? Has it made a difference to any of the any subsequent research and that kind of thing? So I think it's a really important step forward in working that it's not the humanities versus STEM or AHSS versus STEM, but that we're all part of the one culture and that they're not two separate cultures that function in different ways, that we can all actually be professionals. So within universities or research institutions, a STEM researcher is the same as a humanities researcher because we're professionals in that regard. And I do think having common practices in terms of research culture, mentoring, teamwork, all of those kind of things, we can all be trained in that the same way. It doesn't matter what discipline you're coming from.
Thank you very much. Robin, so Nikki mentioned the Technological University. So you've recently, I believe, within the last year or so, joined the South East Technological University, which was formed a couple of months ago, for those of you who don't know, from what used to be Waterford Institute of Technology and Institute of Technology Carlow. So your career before that was mostly in the UK, so sort of coming into this this sort of new university, do you sort of see a difference in research culture in the TU kind of versus your experience of the sort of I suppose traditional universities in the UK?
I do. It's very clear that this conversation has been had much earlier, which is incredibly useful. I think the UK adaptation and our colleague from Queen's mentioned the positive impact of REF, and having survived 3 REF cycles, I would argue that there's a real introduction of survivor bias through REF, and so I'm not too sure I would view the same positive impacts of REF, and I think we need to be careful that we don't lose sight of what is being included or returned in a metrics-driven exercise like that. And in my current role, I spend a lot of time thinking about graduate studies and graduate students, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these are individuals that we are, I suppose, promising a training path, and it's actually an educational program that they're involved with. So losing sight of that, I think, and actually the fact that we're having this conversation now will hopefully allow us not to do that. And I think that is one of the great opportunities and one of the real aspirations of the TU sector, I think, is to embed a lot of these new conversations, relatively new open conversations that we're having, and all of these best practices that we're talking about into all of our cross-cutting new structures that we're trying to implement on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
And do you feel then, because for a lot of the technological universities, they're still sort of at the lower end of the research intensity scale, that maybe there's an opportunity to embed these things at an earlier stage in the development of the institution, so you're not trying to unwind?
Yeah, very, very much so. And one thing that struck in my mind was there was a lot of mention of the credit taxonomy system in terms of assigning contribution for authorship. And we've recently just completed a piece of work on governance for graduate students, and we've incorporated that into our approach to PhD by publication and so on. And it's really nice to see that we can kind of get out in front of where we see these potential problems coming down the line from, let's say, experience in the UK or so on and so forth. So it's quite refreshing from that point of view.
Thank you very much. So does anybody on the floor have any questions for the panel? Pop your hand up if you do. Yes, do we have another microphone? Or will I jump down with mine?
I just have a simple question, just to kind of get a temperature of the room from the different, because there's different stakeholders up on the table, which is amazing. And it would be cool to go from my right, your left to right. What would be your ideal research culture, you know, in like a vision of an ideal research culture in like 3 to 4 words. Like, what are the main points that you see in 5, 10 years? It would be cool to go from this side to that side.
Meritocratic, nurturing, respectful, and honest.
Okay. Yeah, I would say respectful, honest. I would also push for small scale. I trained in a relatively small group, and that was good for both my PhD and postdoc.
Okay, I think I'd possibly start with consistent, because people's experiences seem to be so variable. And I think there needs to be just some consistency for people's experience. So consistent, inclusive, honest. Yeah, thank you.
Again, all my words have been used up. That's what happens when you're near the end of a panel. Words like nurturing, really developing excellence, and I'd put sustainable in every respect, the sustainability in terms of planetary sustainability, but also in terms of the human sustainability of our system.
Yeah, I'll hop on a few of the words. So yeah, I like open, nurturing, and inclusive.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other hands? Yes, just there. Thank you.
So I think the conversations today have been very, very inclusive and very positive, but just to play devil's advocate a little bit, is there a danger here where we're asking researchers to be so rounded, to be so multidisciplinary, that we're going to lose expertise and we're going to lose, you know, that sort of expertise that you're looking for because somebody is in one area? Is there a danger that we're asking for too much from these people and that they're going to burn out?
Good question. Orla.
I wouldn't say that, because I think that, you know, what you expect of your top researchers, if your top researchers are going to be developing PhD students, postdocs, they have to be good at that. They have to understand what that entails. That is part of the job. And in my experience, many of the really best researchers understand that really well, and they're very committed to it. There's part of your question, though, in that who pays for this, okay? All of this is about time. So if I look at what we're doing in UCD, you know, we've established a great support structure, and you've heard a lot of that today, and that takes people's time, and it takes ultimately money. So, you know, we have institutionally put a bit of money into this, but, you know, not an awful lot, because there's a limit to what an individual institution can support. So all the areas we're talking about, data management, open access, they all ultimately cost either time or money, which kind of boils down to the same thing to an extent. So, and we've heard about Research England putting money into this, NWO putting money into this. I do think, and I'm not going to put Nikki on the spot, obviously, but ultimately, I think our system has to recognise that if this is important, you can't just load additional expectations onto a system without realising that it's going to have to be resourced. So I think that at an individual level, I think we can and should expect people to be able to do more here and to respond to the need, but with support, and that support has to be resourced from somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of the time researchers come into this. Oh, thank you. Sorry, my voice is COVID negative. And so a lot of the time people come in to do research and they're quite naive in that they expect the platforms and the supports to be there. And then there's a huge struggle where they're trying to do their research and they're trying to be a data manager expert and they're trying to be an ethics expert. And so I think there is an onus on funders and on institutions to provide those platforms and that support. I think that's really important so that we can have those experts in that area.
Just as an early career researcher, and obviously like I'm surrounded by researchers and all the time, people applying for everything, and I do think the best researchers are still getting, you know, kind of a lot of the funding and the publications and everything, but we're just now being asked to be able to communicate that research better, or you know, those kinds of things. And I don't think that's too big an ask if you are given the, you know, minimal support in your department or in your institution. And there was something else I wanted to say about that I thought was important, but it might come back to me again later. But I think it's still the best, the research is being carried out. You're just expecting people to be able to just add a few extra skills, and that's not a big onus on people if they're given that kind of basic training or basic support within their department.
I think that you're right, but I think sometimes there's an underestimation in terms of the support that people need. Yeah. And so once you give them the support, they can excel, but you can't expect them to excel at everything. So if you're an expert in biology, then there should be support there for ethics, there should be support there for funding management, all of that. So, it's quite multidisciplinary.
I'm glad because that reminded me what I wanted to say, so I'm glad that you said that. I've been mentoring people this year who are applying for the SFI Pathway Grant project this year, because I was successful last year, and people who have read my application have remarked back to me, oh, you really stuck to your guns that this is what you're an expert in. And I was very clear when I was applying, I'm not a digital humanities expert, and because everybody now in the humanities is putting in a digital humanities element. And I was like, nope, I am not very technical, I cannot do any of that, but I am going to use people who are expert in that. And I'm in a very multidisciplinary department, in the Department of Early Irish and Maynooth, and I'm very clear, to everyone, I'm a historian, this is the linguist, this is the archaeologist, this is the whatever, and we all have our areas of expertise, and I'm not going to pretend that I can do those jobs. I'm going to lean on people who are good at that, and the digital humanities is a really big thing now, and people everyone was surprised that I didn't put in a digital element to my application, and I think that's where people are trying to spread themselves too thin and saying that they can do everything, but you can rely on use the experts in that area instead of thinking that you have to tell the funding bodies that you as an individual are able to encompass all of those skills.
Yeah, just a brief comment. One thing we have to be careful of is that what starts out as a good thing doesn't turn into another layer of compliance that gets lumped on to the individual academic. I've seen it happen many times. So instead of employing people to support, you might employ people to create complex Excel sheets that have to be filled in every year and then sent off to another person who's employed to collate the Excel sheets. So I know I'm exaggerating, but we need to be careful that the burden of this is just not another compliance administrative burden that lands in the lap of already burning out researchers.
I just come in quickly, if I may. I think, absolutely. I mean, it's even very clear to me, as somebody not within the research community itself, how much sort of the expected values, behaviours have exploded. It seems, certainly feels to me over the last while. And I sometimes think of them just within my own mind as, we obviously have the domain expertise, but it's nearly transversal skills that are transversal research skills and transversal non-research skills. So with the communication, the project management, but within research, there are certain transversal skills that one needs to carry. And I think that was, one of the real reasons behind the principle of good practice the HEA developed. One of the vice presidents of research at the time said to me, there just seems to be a spaghetti mess of stuff going on. Can somebody put a little bit of sensible shape on it? And I think, to come back and we talk about investment, and I very much hear that, I think that, beyond these four walls, we need to get better at communicating very simply what the value of these principles are, the values of these behaviours, the values of this culture, and the importance of them. And I think that's a shared agenda for all of us.
Thank you. There's a lady here.
Thanks, Jennifer. I don't actually know who this question is for, but just throughout the theme of the day, there's been a lot of conversation around reward and recognition, inclusivity and respect are essential for fixing research culture. But how do you reconcile that with the fact that the career progression is a pyramid? There's only a certain kind of very finite number of positions at the kind of top of the game. So if there's constantly going to be kind of more excellent researchers than there is, job security for them, how do you balance fairness, reward and recognition with that kind of, very limited resource of, job security?
Who wants to take that one? Robin.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a failing on our behalf, that we haven't identified alternative careers enough for those students that we're training and for those researchers, either pre-doctoral or postdoctoral, that come through our groups and through our institutes. I think there's ample rich and rewarding careers available for everyone who gains a PhD, and I think we just need to make that clearer to those people that we're taking on. And I think actually that's an expectation. Someone mentioned generational change. And I think that's an expectation of people who are now coming into the graduate study space as graduate students or as PhD candidates. And it was really evident. I sat on admissions panels for doctoral training programs in the UK, and it was really evident in the questions from the applicants as to what training they would have in trying to gain access to an alternative career, that it was something that they were already thinking about. And so I think the onus should probably shift back to us now to make it seem less like the Hunger Games, I suppose, to borrow a phrase from my children.
Just anecdotally, the last couple of theses I've examined in the UK, the extremely good theses, extremely good PhDs that were going on to the private sector, to better paid jobs, probably just as exciting. And it ties in with what someone mentioned earlier about it's difficult to get postdocs now. So that would imply it's not a problem, that people are finding these alternative careers.
There's a piece, I think, in Impact 2030, Nikki, where it talks about trying to have a much better understanding of where people end up after they do a PhD. And I think that's probably important. Our knowledge is not great on that. We know people get jobs, but we don't know what those jobs are.
No, absolutely. And I think that firstly, I sat in on one of the other priority actions under the European research areas around research careers. And I sat in on a seminar at the start of last week. And one of the speakers interestingly said, these aren't alternative careers, these are the careers. Yeah. We have to stop thinking of them as a plan B. There is certainly, we have grappled with, I'll come back to my hobby horse evidence, that, we know that PhDs do really, really well when they go out into the private sector, but we need to get beneath that level. Like we need to better understand what's going on there. For example, we can see from census figures, and I'm possibly in a minority audience, so I'm waiting with bated breath to see the census CSO release their detailed reports, because it's a treasure trove of information. But if you try to sort of amateurly triangulate that with our statistics and surveys on business expenditure R&D, which includes the personnel, it suggests that, and this is just, it suggests, and that's where Jennifer exactly we need to know more, that there are a lot of PhDs moving into industry, not then necessarily working on as researchers, which is absolutely fine. But it's really important to know that and to know what's going on, because from an economic development perspective, if PhDs are moving in industry and not necessarily working in explicitly research roles, we then need to be careful if we're drawing a conclusion that we're increasing the research intensity of the enterprise by those people transferring, because it's not necessarily the case. So there is an absolute, one of the most important things I think on that side of things is having that deeper understanding. Or one of the questions that has come back to me time and again is, do we want masters or PhD graduates? What disciplines, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I would say though as well at the same time, every country is struggling with this. It's just something we don't typically know enough about.
Or do we just want good people with a good range of skills, Maura, you had a question? Sorry.
No, not at all.
Go ahead.
This isn't necessarily a question, really. It's a comment, I suppose, more than anything. And it builds on a lot of the last few questions that have been asked, is that there is another cohort of individuals, and I think that they did come through a lot today, which is maybe PhDs or those with an academic background that return or remain in the research sector as research support individuals, and it's my experience, and I'm assured that it's the experience of others, that those individuals do not have clear career paths. The research, the recognition, the rewards, they're not there at the moment. And I think, that builds into what's been said about academics and the workload, and maybe being able to rely on experts in other areas within the university themselves, and the entire theme of recognition and reward that has come out up throughout the day. And I was like, that's not a question. I don't know if it can be put to the panel really in any real shape or form, but it's just something that has, I suppose, occurred to me as this conversation has developed this afternoon. So,
does anybody want to comment on that? Yeah, Orla, please.
Just to agree entirely, and I was very struck by the comment earlier on that in UCD, when the technical support staff were invited to a session, they said nobody has ever asked us these questions before. That is so telling. A research enterprise can only succeed when it is firing on all cylinders, when you have the researchers, the research students, the research administrators, the research support staff, the technical support staff, the librarians, and whoever else I've missed in that list. When everybody is working together, there is mutual respect, there is mutual esteem. Everybody knows what contribution each cohort is making to the overall enterprise, values them for that. So you can only succeed if you have that type of environment, and that is very much part of what I think we're trying to bring about in a positive research culture.
Hi, I suppose this goes back to the comment earlier about spreadsheets. I was just, this is maybe a question for the research culture team at UCD, but also the panel. Did anything come across from the surveys or the focus groups in relation to research bureaucracy in the Irish research landscape as being a barrier to excellence in research, given that we've already discussed about the workload on academic researchers? So I suppose in my role, I support researchers at application stage, and I know that it's a constant source of difficulty and draining of time to navigate the bureaucracy around, particularly the Irish funding system. So so that's my query for any thoughts.
Okay, seeing as I love spreadsheets. I've actually been burned. I was head of school for 3 years, and I was, you wouldn't believe it. I think it's interesting that the two of the most prestigious funding agencies that I've dealt with, which are the ERC and the Wellcome Trust, are the lightest on bureaucracy. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm slagging off SFI now. Actually, SFI is not too bad.
I don't think they're here anymore. Oh, sorry, Peter's here.
I can tell you which one was the worst in the Irish system. It wasn't SFI, but I'll tell you that afterwards if you want to know.
I know that one.
Thank you, sorry. Grace has a question and then Maura.
I was just going to respond to that last question to say, yes, it did come across in our survey very strongly that people really were feeling frustrated at the amount of time they had to deal with bureaucracy from the funding agencies, but also from, things like necessary and good things, but they all take time, like ethics and other aspects of governance and, grant registration and all of that, and finance takes up a huge amount of time. So yeah, for sure, anything we can do to simplify that would be great.
And if I can just add to that, there was mention earlier of the Tickell review in the UK, which is a really good report, really clear and concise, and I think with very interesting actions there about the review of research bureaucracy in that system, which is very similar to our own system. So I'd really encourage people to look at that. It calls out not only the bureaucracy associated with the funders, but also the institutions ourselves. We all have a role to play here, and we all have to examine our consciences.
Thank you. Maura?
Okay. Well, first and foremost, I totally agree with you all about the funding of support infrastructures. This cannot be a single institution, nor can it be a single funder. If we were to support all of the infrastructures that we've been asked to support, we wouldn't have any money for research. So I think this absolutely has to be handled at a national level and viewed as national assets. So data repositories, biobanks, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's loads of different infrastructures that are needed. In terms of bureaucracy, though, I will admit that we We do accept that sometimes our application forms are too long and so on and so forth. But I suppose what you've got to keep in mind is that we are in receipt of public money, and we are expected to account for that money. We are very much expected to be accountable for the money. So let's say in comparison to Wellcome Trust, who are a private charity ultimately, they can do whatever the hell they like. If they decide they're not going to talk to somebody for 7 years, away they go. No, there isn't a government in the world that's going to turn around and say, hold on a second, because it's not public money. So I think, you know, the funders are caught between a rock and a hard place. We do appreciate that, you know, the application forms, we've been trying to make them shorter, but God, it's really hard. But on the other hand, there is that accountability issue that I think that researchers have to appreciate. The other thing also was about compliance, and you mentioned, you know, the danger of this becoming just another compliance thing. And I think you sort of briefly referred to ethics.
No, I didn't.
No, maybe somebody else might have. I mean, I'm long enough in the tooth to remember when I was running the research office in Galway initially, there was no ethics committee. And people started coming and saying, oh my God, you know, I can't publish this paper unless I can produce ethics approval. Can you throw together an ad hoc committee so that I can get this paper over the line? Or, you know, I mean, that's literally what was happening. So we thought, okay, well, I think we need to be a little bit more organized than that. But the pushback we got from the community was unbelievable. People were saying, oh my God, here we go, another layer of bureaucracy, going to have to get bloody ethics approval, blah, blah, blah. But of course now, you wouldn't dream of doing research without ethics approval where there's human subjects or vulnerable groups or whatever. You just wouldn't dream of it. So what I would hope, because again, I'm an optimist, is that while we're working through all of these things now, and they probably are feeling like a lot of extra bureaucracy, that over time they will just become part of what it means to be a researcher. But that people will have the wraparound supports to allow them to still be creative and do their work. And it's the wraparound support piece that's really important. And when you talk about alternative careers, a data steward could be seen as an alternative career within research. So could a research statistician, you know, so could a knowledge broker, for example, in the health space. And I think it's about really kind of developing those career paths within research as well, so they can be the wraparound reports for other researchers. And that when you look at a team then, it's got this broad range of expertise, each contributing very important elements to the overall outputs. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Robin?
Yeah, just to come to the point on bureaucracy and something you mentioned, Moira, I think we do have a duty of care. So this is public money, and where we're using it to train graduate students, we have a twofold duty of care in that we've got those students under our guidance. So I think we need to be very careful about adopting a slash and burn approach to, I suppose, bureaucracy without losing sight of the fact that we have people under our care. Yeah.
Doing it in a way that's supportive to researchers, like, you know, if you look at all the different funding agencies, they all have different portals, they all have different terms and conditions, they don't talk to each other about when the timelines are there, so we get a whole load of calls bunched together, leading to, you know, and that all creates a barrier to positive research culture. So it's no one's disputing that there shouldn't be compliance and so on, but to do it in a way that is supportive to the research community and allows them to meet all those compliances in a way that allows them to do their research excellently and with rigor.
Those are points again to a whole of system approach, right? Everyone talking to each other and collaborating. Nikki?
But even, sorry. Oh, no, I was just going to say, but again, you know, it's like using the research office in your institution or your university to help you put together applications and all that kind of thing. So, you know, Yeah. And listen, I don't know, like in Maynooth, they were probably like so overwhelmed and overworked and everything, but they were brilliant. So I was always in conversation with the Research Development Office, and they helped me a lot with my application. And then when people were asking me this year, oh, how do you, and what should I do and how do they do this? And they're coming to me as someone who's been successful. And I'm like, use the resources that the university are offering you, like your research officer is your best friend, and use the, they're the ones who are the experts. They've seen so many applications. They're doing them all the time. So I think, again, it's about communicating to researchers. You're not on your own. We're all on the same team. I'm on, MU team, and that we're all kind of going in the one direction. So don't try to do everything by yourself.
Thanks, Irene. Nikki, you wanted to come in on that?
On that very point. Firstly, just to concur with an awful lot has been said, and particularly with Maura, it is that when we developed the principles of good practice for research within the HEA, under the principle of dignity and respect for the taxpayer was very consciously included to call that out. And I think you've hit on exactly the second point I was going to make, which is I'm not too sure. Now, I'm not an expert on the detail, but, it comes exactly to that point that if you're trying to reduce bureaucracy, but the devil is in the detail, and precisely which piece of bureaucracy should be removed is a hard call. But what one can do, and this is part of the plan under Impact 2030, is improve the consistency of the bureaucracy. There was, we had an extensive consultation process for Impact 2030, and one of the pleas within it was around consistency of approach, was also around the calendar and the spacing of that out. So that has been very much heard, and that is part of the work programme of the strategy, because we can at least do that. I would just note, though, as well, it's interesting, we've two important reports coming out between this and Christmas, and one of them is, maybe it's only interesting to somebody like me, but it's the government...
Me too, Nikki, it's okay.
It's the government R&D budget report, so it details exactly which departments, which agencies spent what on research over the last year or two. And, we know from a high level that there are 5 government departments and their constituent agencies that make about 95% of the public R&D investment. So that's the broad brush picture, but actually, thanks to colleagues of mine such as Eric Shiger, and that there's a lot going on to make sure that we bring as many departments and agencies into that picture so it's as representative as possible. And my understanding, now this is draft at this stage, but I think it's correct, is that we've gotten to a point where there are now over 50 government departments and agencies reporting activity and investment. So there's a lot that can be done around consistency.
Absolutely. Sarah has a question.
Thanks, Jennifer. It links in with all this stuff. So I suppose while there is this discussion around the kind of, review of 2 of our main research funding agencies in Ireland and their kind of relationship with each other going forward, to come back to this comment around calendaring of deadlines, they need to be family friendly. There is this tendency of the agencies all go on holidays and they want all the proposals to be in their inbox when they come back, which means we get a lot of deadlines in September and a lot of deadlines in January, which really excludes certain researchers from applying for those. But similarly, there's this kind of panic to spend a lot of funding in December before the kind of end of the financial year. And again, that is only going to favour certain researchers. And so if we do want to have greater diversity in our research community, that needs to be taken into consideration. And then when it comes to the quality of research, I suppose, and kind of moving away from, I suppose, the over pressurized kind of system, greater notice around deadlines so people can plan 6 months in advance to work on a proposal, because there is this kind of windfall, feast or famine kind of approach where suddenly we have a huge amount of funding for investigator-driven research, you have 10 weeks to submit your proposal. And so, like, I know, for example, the advanced laureates going in, there's a complete oversubscription of that. And so how is that going to impact the quality of the assessment? Because I'm sure the agency is going to be overrun as well. So I think timing the deadlines and as much notice as possible on them could be huge changes in terms of improving the standard and also the ability to participate in research as well.
Thank you. I think that brings up an interesting point, actually. So quite a few of our speakers today mentioned the sort of equality, diversity and inclusion agenda. So does anyone on the panel have any thoughts about how that fits in with research culture and how we could do more maybe in that space, particularly some of the work we've done already? So we've had Athena Swan in Ireland for a number of years. There's a piece of work going to be started now around race equality. So maybe Orla, you might like to comment on that.
Well, really, I was just going to say what you've said there, Jennifer. So we've done an awful lot on gender through Athena Swan, and that has been hugely, I think, to the benefit of our system. But then there are those other forms of diversity. You talked about race equality. Earlier we mentioned disability, neurodiversity. So, you know, there are other types of diversity that need to be considered here because it's integral. It's at the core of a positive research culture.
Just very quickly, if I may, on Impact 2030 and the EDI agenda. I mean, certainly EDI is, you know, it's a cross-cutting departmental priority. We have looked at this sort of broken down into sort of two broad components. So the first would be the representativeness of the research community itself, but also EDI in terms of the research activity, you know, to the extent to which relevant topics are supported by funding agencies, who's being brought into focus groups and such like. So, you know, there's a couple of angles, but I think we'll see a lot of work in this space over coming years.
But I don't think you can get around the fact that only people who can afford to be a researcher are the ones who are going to get funding to be a researcher. You know, like it's a bit of a, you know, a wheel or whatever, you know, like it's only people, you know, you don't have any security of tenure, you know, precarity is the biggest issue that researchers are facing, and you spend so much time applying for your next job or your next funding opportunity instead of doing the actual research that the taxpayers' money is, you know, supposed to be going towards. So only people, you know, trying to be more inclusive and have a more, you know, diverse spectrum of researchers, you know, it's only people who, you know, have someone perhaps paying their rent or whatever, you know, that's going to, you know, if you, like my big thing as a mother is I am very mobile to apply for positions outside of Ireland, and that limits, you know, my choices. You know, and a job might come up in another country and it's like, oh, Niamh, you know, you should go for that. And it's like, well, you know, I have 3 kids, and that's always going to be something that limits people's choices. So.
Yeah, I think that's really important. A couple of people already today have mentioned generational change being driven from the early career researchers, but the work from the US that identifies your chances of becoming a tenured academic based on your parents' position within the university system is something that's worrying and something that we need to identify and get a hold of now, because otherwise that generational change will never see the full benefit of it. And I think you're right, someone else spoke about the kind of funnel towards the top. And at the top it's homogenous, which is unfortunate, and I think that is truly something that we need to tackle. Yeah.
And if I can throw in on this, because I'm throwing it into every conversation I'm in at the moment, PhD stipends, way past time to address that issue.
Yes, absolutely, and it's a huge challenge. Nikki?
Just to come in on this as well, if I may. I think firstly, yeah, there's been a lot of work done in the US. I mean, there's some very interesting work around, you know, what's an optimal global innovation toolkit as such, on one of the really untapped constituencies or underrepresented communities within the RNI system. But it is a generational, if not multi-generational issue. Secondly, just back to my favourite statistics, I'm always very struck by the fact that we've approximately 11,000 research students in Ireland. 4,000 of those don't receive any stipend whatsoever. They're completely self-funded, which speaks to your point, Niamh. It's much bigger than I'd ever anticipated. So just to give sort of a wider sense of the picture.
Thanks. So I'm going to think about drawing this to a close now. So I just wanted to ask maybe one final question for me. And So one of the worries I have with all these areas, and I'm involved in various different conversations around that, like EDI, around open research, around research assessment, this whole research culture, integrity area, is that sometimes, and even with events like this, you end up preaching to the converted. So you have people in the room who are interested in this agenda and you want to drive it forward. And our speakers earlier, at least two of them referred to this having to be a bottom-up approach, having to get the research community involved in this a lot more. So maybe just throw this to the panel. Are there good ways to get the research community more involved? I know, Dan, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's not exactly answering your question, but what I would say is funders have a lot of power.
Okay.
You know, I've seen a couple of things change. For example, in my lifetime, used to be postdocs didn't have pensions. It just didn't occur to anybody to give a postdoc a pension.
They still don't in some quarters, but that's a story for another day.
Oh, really? And then I think it was Wellcome first decided we're going to give them pensions, and everybody else followed suit. Also, funders made it a stipulation that sequence data had to be deposited and made publicly available, and that then researchers followed suit. So I think funders have a lot of power. If they require something, people will do what they're told.
Yeah, we've seen that with the EPIG and research integrity training. If funders say you have to do it, people do it.
And open access, like, so so everything I produce, has to be open access. Maternity leave, exactly. It's not the universities, it's the funders that said, you need to give people maternity leave, and so it's.
And do you think, Orla, that maybe institutions could do with being a little bit more at the forefront of this and not sort of say, oh, well, the funders are the ones who are being innovative? I'm not saying the universities aren't, but...
Yeah, absolutely. And there are things that funders can do and in many cases are doing. There are things that institutions absolutely need to do, including, I think, you need leadership on this at the highest level in the institutions, leadership that is clear, that is unequivocal, that is visible, and that is authentic, that this is not just lip service. You need to reflect this then in instruments. So we in UCD have modified our promotions policy to take into account a greater diversity of outputs beyond publications, to take into account contribution to research culture. That really drives behaviour within an institution, and putting in place support structures as well that enable all this. So I think the institutions have a huge role to play.
Thank you. So just to think about sort of some closing thoughts about this, and we were thinking about action points. I think that was one of the things that Anita mentioned to me as she asked me to take this on because she was unwell. One of the things that struck me today was maybe that this whole area of reform of research assessment is one way to take this forward, because it's something that I think institutions can do, it's something that funders can do, it's potentially something that policymakers like Nikki can bring into the fore as well. But I might just ask the panel, are there any sort of action points that you think we could get started on straight away, or we should be planning for the next year or so to take this research culture agenda forward? Nikki?
Just coming quickly, firstly, I absolutely agree. I think that the work that's happening on research assessment reform is going to be pivotal to this, because that's about what do we value and how do we value it. So it's at the heart of what we're doing here and what research culture is about. So I think, as far as I understand, the Commission has, invited a coalition of interested parties. People at HRB are involved, institutions are involved. So I would encourage people to participate in that dialogue. So that we can contribute, but also we can leverage what's happening there. I would also encourage people to keep an eye out for the updated HGA Principles of Good Practice, because it gives that good, just simple, accessible, and Jennifer, you've spoken about what can we do within the research community. But for somebody like me, I'm constantly trying to convince people beyond the research community. So just to think in that regard as well. And just one final suggestion, if I may. The Dutch position paper on Room for Everyone's Talent, that's the little 8-pager, isn't it? There's a small document, Room for Everyone's, and it is one of the most uplifting documents that I've ever read. I read it regularly just to cheer myself up. And I would highly recommend it, because it really, it articulates and it inspires an awful lot about, for me, what this is about. So just some food for thought. Thank you.
Nuggets of wisdom. Yeah. Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to bring this discussion to a close. Thank you so much to our panellists today for sharing their opinions so candidly with us. Thank you to you in the audience for taking part. And I'm going to hand back to, I think it's either Adrian or Grace to close off today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and to all our panellists for a really excellent discussion. I think it's all been said today. I think we're kind of talked out for today anyway. But I very much hope that this won't be the end of similar discussions about research culture and related matters in Ireland. And maybe some of our other institutions around the room today would like to take up the challenge and the opportunity to maybe consider another date in the future when we might come together to talk about it. Thanks all very much. Been great having you. And just to remind you again, all of the presentations and the discussions will be on our website and on UCD Research YouTube channel, I think, Jill, before too long, and we'll let you all know when they're up. Thanks everyone. Safe home. Take care.